This is a little different for me tonight. I don't have to do anything. It all falls back on Beth. So ready? Here we go, Beth.
Very good. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And Phil, I'm very glad that you showed up. That was the first step toward a successful event tonight.
Yep.
It's really a lot of fun and an honor for me, actually, to be able to turn the tables on Phil Hamilton. He's done such a fantastic job with the Let Me Introduce You series. He's just a great interviewer. So I've got big shoes to fill, but we're going to go ahead and get started. So I think we're going to start with a photograph that probably a number of you have not seen before. Tori, are you able to put that up for us?
Oh, yes.
All right. So this little guy is 4-year-old Phil. What a cutie. So Phil, tell us a little bit about what life was like for this whippersnapper.
Well, I was actually born in Spokane, Washington, but at a very early age, we moved to Montana. My father worked for International Harvester Company, and so really I consider myself a Montanan, if you will, and Montana is certainly a unique state. When we were there, the population was 2 people per square mile, gigantic state, but a very independent state. And so I went all the way through schools there and graduated from high school there. And my first 2 years of college I did there in Billings. But Montana is an interesting state. I was telling Beth an example of their independence. For a long time, Montana did not have a speed limit, except their definition was reasonable and sane. So that meant if you were driving 20 miles an hour and the conditions didn't allow it, they could give you a ticket. If you're driving 80 miles an hour and the conditions allowed it, they would leave you alone. And that's kind of an indication in my mind of the independence of Montana. And so I grew up in Montana, and I think that independence and that sort of take care of yourself attitude sort of permeated my life all the way through. And so I had a brother and sister. Both of them were quite a bit younger. My mom had miscarriages, so my brother worked for Conoco Oil for a long time and had lived in Texas, but recently moved back to Billings. And my sister lives in Boise, Idaho, but we're very much spread out. So I think as we've gotten a little bit older, we've tried to stay in touch with each other as it's gone along. My mom and dad were interesting people. I think the influence they had on me and my brother and sister were by model. My dad traveled all the time. He'd get up early Monday morning and be gone all week, come home late Friday night. And so the day-to-day raising of the family really fell to my mom. But my dad was a very hard worker, kind of an interesting sidelight. My father never went to college, but because he worked so hard, he worked for International Harvester for 35 years. And then he was laid off because he didn't have a college degree. And it was interesting because I think that made my father insistent about us getting college degrees. It was kind of interesting because it's kind of a payback. My dad died at 99, so think about that. He retired at 55, had benefits for the rest of his life. Sort of paybacks were hell for that company because he certainly got his money worth after that. But that really hurt him because he was a hard worker and he knew the farmers and he knew how to sell equipment. And they replaced him with a college guy who didn't have a clue what farming was about. And so it's kind of an interesting story. So that's sort of a snapshot of my early years, if you will.
Yes. And you know, first of all, interesting, 2 people every 2 miles in Montana. Is that what you said?
Yeah, 2 people per every square mile was the population of Montana. Yeah.
Yeah. That would make social distancing pretty easy, wouldn't it?
Very easy. Yes, it would.
So it's interesting to think about the incredible times in history that you have lived through. Just thinking about technological changes alone. What are some of the highlights of changes that you've seen, or lowlights? What are some of your observations over this? I'm not saying that you're old, but you've lived through a lot of history.
Well, we'll leave that for a later moment.
Yeah.
Well, you know, I remember when I started teaching, when I graduated from college, I had 3 contracts to teach. One was in Anchorage, Alaska, and the salary was $7,200 a year. That's $7,200 a year. Uh, I had a contract in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and the salary there was $4,200 a year. And I had a contract at Edwards Air Force Base in a public school system, and the salary was $5,200 a year. And we decided, because everyone was coming to California, that Sue and I would come to California. So we did. We thought all of California was on the beach. We discovered very quickly that there was a lot of sand at Edwards Air Force Base, but not much water. But we had a chalkboard. The big bane of a teacher was your clothes were always dirty because you were writing with the chalk on the chalkboard. We had a 16 millimeter projector. We had a hand-driven crank duplicating machine. And you think now of what it's like, it's just mind-blowing, the changes just in education, let alone our whole culture. But I think the good about that is I have touched base with people that I've totally forgotten about through Facebook and through email and all of them. That's been really kind of fun to reach out and touch bases with some people that I'd totally forgotten about. But it has been dramatic. If I were to go back in the classroom today, I'm not sure I'd survive, because I have my grandson help me out with all that technology stuff like a lot of us do.
Yeah, those digital natives know what they're doing. So you
I
mentioned,
I would add one thing. I do worry a little bit sometimes about young people. I think part of my success has been that I enjoy being around people and think I have some skill at being close to people and being good friends. And I worry sometimes about young people getting so tangled up with communicating via technology that maybe they don't know how to interact in person with people. And that bothers me a bit.
yeah, well, like any tool always has can be used for good or can be not so good. So it's interesting. Just
Sure.
yeah, I guess time will tell on that one.
Yep.
But you mentioned how you and Sue were making this decision about where you were going to live. So back up just a little bit and tell us about how you met. And I think we have a wedding picture we can share. How did you meet, and how did you know that Sue was the one for you?
Well, I look at that. But that's my mom and dad on the right, and Sue's mom and dad on the left. Uh, I was a sophomore at Eastern Montana College, which was a small college there in Billings, and Sue was from Sydney, a small town way off in the eastern end of Montana. And the routine was that there was cheerleader tryouts, and of course, all of us big sophomores would go and check out all of the cheerleader candidates. And so that's where I first met Sue, and uh, we sort of kind of hung out, and then gradually I began to appreciate what a wonderful young lady she was, and we dated pretty seriously. And then I left Eastern and went to Missoula, and Sue stayed there in Billings and worked. And then we got married the year between my junior and senior year, and she moved to Billings, and we've been together ever since. 57 years. She deserves a large medal for putting up with me. Yeah, I really, when we talk about me, it's hard to talk about me without including her, because she's been so much a part of my life for so long, and has put up with some stuff that it's just amazing. I was telling Beth, I came to Big Bear and worked for a year, and then I got a grant from the National Science Foundation. The federal government was concerned that economics at that time really wasn't economics. It was how to balance your checkbook and those kinds of things. And those are important. It just wasn't economics. And so they selected 15 of us from all over the country to go to the University of Washington and study for a year real legitimate economics. And so away we went, and money was not a particular problem, but we had 2 young kids, and Sue was pregnant with my daughter, Sharon. And so, because I'm not a real good student, I really had to work hard. And with having 3 young kids in base housing, the restroom was on the 2nd floor, if you can imagine that. So Sue was really a true soldier in terms of taking care of these young kids, because I was gone so much. And that's really been the story of her and I's relationship all along.
Yeah, I think we were saying that we'll need to get her interviewed for one of these at some point too, because she has her own remarkable story, and
Yep,
she's
she
done
does.
so much for the community.
Yep.
Yeah, that's great. So you, when you were on that program and developing that curriculum, you were at University of Washington, right?
That's correct.
And that was at a very interesting time in history. Um, Actually, lots of documentaries surfacing about that now, interestingly enough, about the what was going on, kind of the maelstrom that was caused by Vietnam, the Equal Rights Amendment, just lots of cultural turmoil. What was that like for you at UW?
Yeah, it was at times very troubling because I was an older student and there was not a bra in sight on that campus, I don't think. Uh, and lots of protests and stuff that was a little bit troubling to me, just because it was so different. And because I was there, I was, a father, a student, had three young kids, and I was there to take care of my business. And all of this protest stuff was just kind of disarming for me. But it certainly was interesting to watch it happen because I think most of these young people were very sincerely concerned about what was going on. There were obviously some hangers on that were just kind of nutcases, but most of them, I think, were very sincerely concerned about the war. I remember one of our professors dismissed class, and he didn't require, but you certainly felt the pressure that he wanted the university to provide daycare for all of the students. And that was kind of interesting to me and a little bit troubling. Uh, but I think all in all, it certainly was an interesting thing to observe from a distance, to watch these young people. When I was growing up, for us to protest something just simply was unheard of. You just didn't do that. But it was an interesting time, and I think probably in retrospect, uh, it made our world a better place now because these people just didn't talk about it. They stepped up and did something about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's very true. And, it ebbs and flows, but that you had a very interesting perspective on that you don't hear about much. You hear about people reflecting on the ones who were doing the protesting, but not somebody that was saying, I'm just trying to get my education done here. So interesting stuff.
Yeah.
So then you came back, and you came back in what capacity? Back to Big Bear?
Yeah, I was gone for a year and then I came back in 1969 and started teaching, taught social studies and economics, and gradually over time, I don't know exactly how it happened because I was very happy in the classroom, but I gradually evolved into becoming a counselor and then went over to the dark side and became an administrator. At one point, this was all at Big Bear High School, the now middle school campus. At one point, I was the vice principal, I was the activities director, and I was the athletic director at the time. Now I think they have separate people doing all of that, but it was you were busy. There wasn't much time. And remember, this was the time where drugs were very prominent and it was all new to us. I don't remember taking a class of how to deal with drug-involved kids. I don't think there was one out there, but this vice principal stuff is tough stuff. And it was very busy. And the high school was about 700 students at that time. And it was an interesting time. So I stayed there at Big Bear High School doing that for a while. And then, interestingly enough, the superintendent at that time, this was in March. Remember, I'm a secondary guy. My personality, my training, I'm a secondary guy. The superintendent came over and sat down in my office and he said, have you ever thought about being involved at an elementary school? And I said, not only no, but hell no. I don't know anything about elementary schools. And he said, well, I think you better think about it. And I thought, well, I need to talk to my wife. This was in March. And I thought he was talking about the next school year. And he said, well, the school board has decided that we're moving you to the principalship at North Shore School in 2 weeks. And I thought, 2 weeks? What are you talking about? Well, all of a sudden, there I was, an elementary principal in this world of little people. And it was an interesting transition. I think it was, as looking back on my career, I think the time I spent as an elementary principal, as a middle school principal, were very helpful in understanding that whole culture of elementary school. I mean, these teachers were concerned about how many different kinds of pencils they should have. Well, you have one pencil, isn't that enough? They had 47 different kinds of paper that they wrote. I had no feeling for any of that stuff, but I learned pretty quickly. And so it was an interesting time. So I was there 5 years, and then I was a middle school principal for 5 years. and then went back to the high school as the principal and was there for 7 years.
And you were talking about that, that, you know, the drugs creeping into the school system and so forth. And I think we have another picture here to share, Tori. So it just begs the question, because that was kind of what was going on in the 60s and 70s. Looking at the picture of you on the right, Phil, were you a hippie?
Well, you might wonder. I can share an interesting story. I think Ron and Elena are out there. Ron and Elena Peavy were good friends even before they got married. And we used to go to San Diego and spend time with her parents. And one time we were there and her mother said, you know, your hair is pretty long. I think you ought to have a perm. And I thought, what do you mean have a perm? And so she got out the curlers and away we went. And that sort of led to me having that afro for a while. His mom is still alive, and she was a good friend and a good friend. So I don't think I was a hippie, but maybe you'll have to make judgment of that on your own, I guess.
Well, yeah, well, maybe you really can't say. But that's a great picture of you. I didn't realize that that was actually planned hair. I thought that was the natural look.
It was not, trust me.
That's great. Well, part of your notoriety here in Big Bear, most of it, I think, comes from all of your years in education, but some of it also comes from your outdoor activities. So your cycling and trails. So tell us a little bit about how you got involved in that world.
Well, you know, it seemed like when Sue and I moved here, we sort of gravitated to getting involved with stuff other than the time we spent in the classroom. And Sue and I were on the original community concert board. Some of you know what community concerts are about. But as I got a little bit older, I particularly after I don't retire very well, and I worry sometimes that what I'm, you know, because I've been so busy for so long. And a bunch of us kind of got together and sat around grumbling about the trail conditions and all of that stuff. And so finally, we just decided we need to do something about it. Instead of sitting around grumbling about it, let's see if we can't do something about it. So we got a group together and we became actually a subcommittee of the Park and Recreation District for a while. And that's how the thing originally started. And then as we became a nonprofit, that made the Park and Rec Board nervous, so we became a nonprofit. It was called the Big Bear Trails Foundation. And if you'll know some of the early successes we had, the signs around the lake really were a product of our efforts. And the bike trails, that not the off-road stuff, but the signs that go through the city were a part of our efforts. And so we had some earlier successes. I'm not exactly sure why we were so successful. I guess we had people that cared and people are willing to spend some time and had some good connections. And gradually we evolved into taking a look at the off-road stuff. And we started, Randy Putz, you probably know him, he found a trail that was legal, meaning it was official, but it had been grown over. It didn't exist anymore. So that was an opening for us to say, this is something we can work on, called Seven Oaks. And so we got out our hand tools and started working on that trail. Apparently a lot of people had tried to do that, but they weren't serious. It's hard work. Once the Forest Service realized we were serious, then they began to bring some crews in and we reopened that Seven Oaks Trail. It's a tricky trail, but it goes from Grandview down into the Santa Ana River. But that was sort of I think an important moment in the evolution of this, because they realized we were going to play by the rules, but we were going to do things. And we had jokingly talked about Skyline for a long time. And we kept saying, you know, someone's going to get killed running up and down that 2N10 road. They ride too fast, the cars are up there, blah, 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 blah. Wouldn't it be fun to have a trail kind of roughly parallel to 2N10? And we thought it was a joke. But there's a slide, Tori, you might show that kind of was a turning point in that whole project. The top right is really the influential group that was this original bunch. And the check you'll notice is for $80,000, $80,000. Scott Tangenberg, he's the gentleman on the right, called me one day and he said, are you sitting down? I said, what do you mean am I sitting down? He said, you need to sit down. He said, we wrote a grant and we didn't tell you about it because we really didn't think we had a chance to get it, but we got it. And I thought, yeah, well, yeah, it'll be a couple $1,000. It was for $80,000, and it was exclusively to move ahead with Skyline Trail. Well, $80,000, all of a sudden, everything changes. So we hired IMBA to do design. We hired an internationally known trail designer because we had money now. And reasonably quickly, that wonderful Skyline Trail, I think most people would say, if it isn't the best in Southern California, it certainly is one of the best. It's 15 miles long, wide variety of, from some pretty nice flowy stuff to some pretty challenging stuff. And probably I was sleeping. People oftentimes give me credit for doing that, and obviously I can't do that alone. It was that core group of people that were influential and committed to making this happen that really brought that about. So that's really a major accomplishment of the Trails Foundation, was that wonderful Skyline Trail. But then it's kind of, you know, there's now much better signage. There's much better consistent work being done. Very, very proud of, you know, if we were instrumental in getting some things started, and I think we were. I think that now when you get out and look around, it's really amazing the accomplishments that we have done. You might go back to that picture, Troy, just a second. When I be out riding, and lots of my friends, you know, lots of people come to the mountains, and you know, they're not dumb or anything. They ask questions, and sometimes you kind of like, where's the lake and stuff like that. But we kept talking about there needs to be a group that's out there that is well informed, they have some information, and are willing to help people. And so we got together and created a trail host program. That picture on the left is the original group that was trained. We now have trained almost 100 trail hosts. And basically all we do is what we do anyway. We simply go out and ride and hike and talk to people. And normally when you approach people, they think you're trying to sell them something. And we're not. We're trying to give them some information. And we've cards and we have a website. And so I think it's been a real service to the community that we're out there helping people. People just want to be out and want some information. And once they realize you're not trying to sell them something, you want to give them some information, they relax and are very excited to have you help them. And so that's been a major accomplishment, I think. The other thing I just add in passing is, as this thing began to grow, it really, you know, volunteers are great for a while, but they get worn out. And we always knew that we needed to see if we couldn't find the money to hire a full-time trails coordinator. And I think 3 years ago, we finally, with the help of the Discovery Center and the Forest Service and the city and the county, were able to put together a package of money and hire Bennett Roselle, who is a full-time non-motorized trail coordinator. It's made a lot of difference in this whole thing. So that's been a big success and a big part of my life. And I had a knee replacement, and the doctor said, as part of your recuperation, you need to swim. And I don't like to swim. I don't like water. I just don't. So Sue and I bought some old dumb bikes. I think we paid probably $300 for both of them and started riding. And then it's just become part of our life. We've traveled all over the United States, and in some cases all over the world with our bike riding. It's just been a fun part of our life. And I think it's kept me fairly healthy and fairly sane, particularly during this time, because at least I can get out and ride and hike. And so that's a good deal.
Yeah. And there have been so many benefits. I mean, all that great signage has made such a big difference from what I can recall of the trails. And that benefits the forest. It benefits all of us because people are staying on the official trails and not, you know, not forging new trails and leaving trash where they shouldn't. So, you know, it's not a small thing at all.
Yeah.
But,
we always used to say to people, you know, people are going to come and they want to do the right thing. They really do.
Yeah.
If you don't give them some direction, they're going to just go willy-nilly wherever. But once the signs are there, and most people are going to respect those. There's a small percentage that won't, but most of them want to do the right thing. And so that's cool.
Yeah. And it's really been great. And it continues on, right? The group is still doing great things.
Yeah, we've folded in and become part of the Discovery Southern California Mountains Foundation, I think it's called now. I think the next big project is going to be, they're very close to having what is the equivalent of Skyline on the North Shore, where you would be able to ride from one end of the valley to the other. The ultimate goal is that you could ride or hike the entire perimeter of the valley on a single track trail. Now you get down towards the dam, and that's pretty tricky. But I think once that North Shore project gets done, and it's very close to being finished, then I think putting those final pieces together, think how fun that would be able to traverse the entire valley on a single track. Wouldn't that be cool? And I think that's within striking range. So that's very exciting. And also the trail maintenance, that every winter there's trail damage, and they have crews that can do the work, but you think about it, they don't know. So part of our host job is to get out on those trails and say, there's 3 trees down here, there's a washout there. So those work crews are directed where to go to do that work, rather than just saying, well, where do we start? And there's been a lot of redesign. They call them user-created trails. Most of them are designed poorly. They don't shed water well. And so we've redesigned a lot of trails to make them much more functional. And that's all good stuff.
Yeah, that is. And I learned a lot about how much engineering goes into creating a good trail, which I didn't know before. And it seems like a simple thing, but it really isn't.
Yeah,
So,
I didn't know it either. And it makes a world of difference when you go out. When we have a big winter and you look at Skyline, the damage on Skyline is minimal, and it's because it's designed well. You
yeah.
look at other trails and they're torn up, and it's because they're designed poorly. And so it just makes a world of difference over the long run.
Yeah, we're so grateful for all of that. So, in addition to all of that, Phil, the other thing that I think I know I've known you for, and several other people on this call, is just you and Sue both having so much dedication to the artists of our valley and to the performing arts. You show up for everything all the time, and in particular, I know that you love music and jazz specifically. So where did that come from?
My mother, obviously I was smarter than my mother until I got to be about 25, and then I realized how smart she was. She was insistent that I go to community concerts, these god-awful, boring symphonies. But I think she drugged me to those things, and begrudgingly I went. But I think that maybe implanted some kind of appreciation for the arts early on in my life. And my mother also wanted me to learn how to play an instrument. And I was smarter than her, of course, and never did. Now I wish that I had. But I think that initial exposure was really important to me. And we enjoy music, live music. We like to dance together. Whenever we travel, we find live music venues to go to. And we do everything we can to bring those here to Big Bear wherever we can. As I mentioned, we were on the community concert board for a long time until that sort of died a slow, painful death. But much of that is just simply we enjoy going and hearing young people entertain, old people entertain, people from on the hill and off the hill. That's just sort of part of our life. And part of doing that is you've got to go and support those people and pay a few bucks and get out there and join them. So yeah, that's an important, the jazz thing, I don't know where that came from, but if you'd look at my record collection, you'd know that jazz is something that's important to me. I guess the independence of that, somebody once said, a lot of musicians spend their whole life worrying about making a mistake because they're classical musicians and they worry about making a mistake. Jazz people are encouraged to make mistakes. That's what jazz is often about. And I thought that was an interesting observation. I used to kid Sharon Rizzo about that. I said, Sharon, you need to start making some mistakes and join in and get involved in this. But we truly like that particular kind of music. But we're not partial to country western or to classical music, any of that stuff. Just when we sit down to listen to music at home, 99% of the time it's going to be some kind of jazz.
Yeah. Well, I know I and a lot of people on this call appreciate your support. But you mentioned when you go off and travel, you always try to find out about the music scene and experience it wherever you go. So I think we have a slide from one of your trips to share, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about your travel highlights.
Well, let's see. What's Tori going to bring up? Oh yeah, this is Stingray City in the Caribbean. We were on a cruise. And those cruises, they have all these different excursions, and everybody said this Stingray City is very cool. So we got on a little boat and we went out quite a ways, and here was this collection of stingrays. That's why it's called Stingray City. And you got in the water, and these things were very friendly, obviously. They come right up to you, and It was very exciting. Stingrays, you think of stingrays, you don't want to get near them. They're going to sting you. But these were very interesting, and there were just a lot of them around, and they were very used to people, and so it was kind of exciting. But we sort of got the travel bug, I guess you'd say, and we have been to China. Spent 3 weeks in China, probably one of the more interesting, excuse me, trips, just because the culture was so different. We did a cruise in Russia. We've been to England and been to Costa Rica, and really have enjoyed traveling a lot. As we've gotten older, these long plane flights have become a little bit troubling for us. And I'm not saying we won't do it again, but I know when we came back from Russia, I think it was, I don't know, 18 hours nonstop. I was a screaming Mimi. It just was too much. And that isn't saying we won't do it again, but it's harder and harder to do those long. And there are lots of interesting places in this country that we haven't visited. We love New Orleans. On our bike trips in New England, several years, we went back there and rode our bikes through New England, and great time. And so, yeah, we've done pretty well, and I hope we'll start traveling again.
I just have to say, Sharon just posted in the chat that she makes plenty of mistakes, but I'm skeptical. I don't know about everybody else.
She's very good about that. I was kidding her one time, you play all this classical stuff, you do these show tunes. When are you going to do some jazz? And we were at a concert someplace, and Sharon said, this guy Hamilton has been bugging us, so we're going to do, and they did. So it's very cool. I appreciate it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's wonderful. Oh, we've got questions coming in. So Mike Harrison wants you to tell us about your hat.
Well, this particular hat belonged to my father. When he passed away, we all went there for the service and kind of looked through some things. And because I love hats, I brought home one of his hats, and that's what this is about. I don't know why I've become known for my hats. I guess as I got bald, I needed to protect my head so I didn't get sunburned. And we have hats all over the place, I guess, and I just wear hats all the time. But this particular one was one of my father's hats.
Oh, that's wonderful. I don't know, I think a lot of you have been faithful followers of the Let Me Introduce You series. You may have noticed that Phil has a different hat every time. So we're looking forward to even more hats. And so I want to ask you one more question, Phil, because the reason why we wanted you to chair the Let Me Introduce You series is because I, along with everybody who knows and loves you, has observed your skill, your drive really to get to know people. You really are an anthropologist at heart, I'd say, because whenever we've gone anywhere with you, you bump into people and you want to know genuinely about their lives, and you make instant connections with people. It's really quite remarkable. So where do you think, how did that evolve over time? Where do you think that came from for you?
Well, that's an interesting question. I guess when I was a junior, when I left Eastern Montana College, my first year in college, I majored in beer drinking and playing ping pong, I think. And I barely had a C average. But towards the end of that year, I had a speech class from a guy that was really an interesting guy. And he kind of took an interest in me. And so I got involved in intercollegiate public speaking and debate. And so when I went to the university, I went on a debate scholarship. So we traveled around all over the country acting like we knew what we were talking about. And generally we didn't. But I got at ease, I think, in being around people and talking in front of people and all of that. And I really, part of traveling for us is getting to know people. You can go through cities and never talk to anybody. What's that about? That's no fun. You look at all the tourist traps and all that stuff. But when you sit down at a restaurant or in a bar and say, hey, what's your story? And you connect with people, it just makes that whole thing come alive. And so, pardon me, that's what's been fun for us. And once you start doing that, it sort of becomes part of your style, I guess. And even here in Big Bear, when I go out to have dinner and stuff, Sue and I'll talk, but I'd much rather talk to the guy next to me at the bar, or the guy across from me at a table, and see what his story is. And so it's just, I think, become part of my personality.
Yes. But I think you've also collected a lot of wisdom along the way from all of those interactions. So I actually have one more question for you, and I'm going to invite everybody else to post their questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand and Tori can unmute you if you're really fancy with using Zoom. But I just want to ask, if you were to become Secretary of Education at the state or federal level, with all that you've learned over the years, what's one thing that you would do for public education? What would you do to improve it?
Well, if I were the head of the federal education department, I'd eliminate the department. Probably wouldn't get away with that. But, you know, I think sometimes we get all tangled up with all these fancy programs and all this stuff coming from the feds and the state and all over the place. And we forget that in the end, it really is the teacher in the classroom with young people is where it really happens. And I think supporting quality teachers, making sure they're paid the very best they can be, and giving them some latitude to be creative. I think there needs to be expectations, obviously, but I think giving them the latitude to say, here's what we want people to learn, get in there and see that they learn that stuff is really what it's all about. And so I think as much as I would do if I were in that position, it would be supporting quality teachers, making sure they were well prepared in their subject area and that they knew how to teach. As I hang around and listen to people talk about having student teachers, the one thing I hear is that a lot of these people do not have a clue how to deal with 35 kids in a classroom. They don't have any idea how to deal with that. And I'm not sure exactly how you teach that, but I think I've often thought that people that wanted to be teachers, along about the second year in college, they had to throw them into a classroom and give them some reality therapy about what being in a classroom is really all about. But in the end, we need to remember that where the action really is in that classroom with well-qualified people that care about kids. And if I were king, I'd do everything I could to make sure that happened.
You have a lot of people on here probably nodding their heads. Thank you, Phil.
Sure.
Tori, do you want to read questions from the chat? I don't want to leave you out.
Oh no, I'm having a great time listening. But Brian did actually post a question. Brian, would you like me to unmute you and then you can ask it yourself? No, he's good. Okay, so I'll read it. Brian asked, what careers other than education did you consider?
Well, you know, when I graduated from high school, I was not going to go to college. I wanted to go into the Air Force and I wanted to be a pilot. And my mother was adamant about the fact that you're going to go to college for at least a year and have that experience. And so I wandered through my freshman and part of my sophomore year. I didn't have a clue what I wanted to do. But gradually towards the end of my sophomore year, I began to think about becoming a teacher. So I guess I would tell you that I never seriously thought about doing anything else. I just didn't.
That's amazing. I feel like there are a lot of people in education like that. They just knew that that was their North Star.
Yep.
Yeah, good stuff. How about a question? I've got just a couple of others, and that we've got some others coming in now. Tori, you want to do that one?
Yes, and then Elena PV also raised her hand. So I'll go ahead and unmute you, Elena, and then you can ask it, and then we'll go to Wayner next.
Actually, it's more of a comment than a question, but we were on the China trip with Phil, and it was so wonderful because, again, Beth, as you mentioned, he was using his anthropological skills to glean as much information as he could. So every time we went out to a meal, which was often because all the meals, we went, by the way, 2 weeks after 9/11. It was very interesting. It was really interesting. And Phil, at every meal, started talking to our servers, trying to ask them what it was that we were eating. None of them spoke English, ever. And they could never answer any of his questions. And so he never got an answer to what we were eating. And we figured, you know what? It's probably better that we don't know.
Well, it's interesting. When we were in China, when you'd go to a restaurant, they'd have these big, gigantic Lazy Susans. And there would be all this stuff that you didn't know what it was. And finally, funny, we just said, look, we're here for an adventure. Let's eat it and hope we live. And we did. It was an adventure.
I think we've got another one in the chat.
Yes. So Al Weiner asked, you and Sue spent a fair amount of time sailing a Hobie in Big Bear. Where else have you sailed?
Well, the Hobie Cat thing, really, the only place that we sailed was on Big Bear Lake. We got involved and did some racing, and we actually never sailed our Hobie Cats anywhere else other than Big Bear Lake. We were involved in a small sailing group, and that was a fun time for us. It's funny, the things that you do when you're raising children, that you never know the impact. We originally decided we wanted to sail, and we bought an old, awful single hull boat, weighed a ton, and we drug our kids on this thing, and you know, it was slow and it just wasn't much fun. But it's interesting, our second son Greg and our daughter Sharon could care less about sailing. Blake, our oldest son, now he's an electrician, but if he could make a living racing big sailboats, that's what he would do. He sailed Transpac 2 or 3 times and really sailed all over the world. So it's kind of funny. I know that seed of interest and involvement in sailing was planted from those early years where we drug our kids out. Sailboats, you know, initially aren't much fun. When they're fun to go out and just kind of bounce around. But as kids got older, they wanted something more exciting, and that's when we got into the Hobie Cat thing. But the only place we sailed our Hobie Cats was on Big Bear Lake.
Still, that Big Bear Lake can be pretty challenging, I understand.
It can indeed.
Crosswinds and yeah.
It
Good
really
stuff.
can, but it was fun.
So Phil, what quality do you admire most in a person?
What quality do I admire most in a person? Interesting. I guess people that are truly honest. You know, sometimes it's hard sometimes to be honest with people because you know you might hurt them or offend them or something. But at least my very best friends, at times we have really, I was going to say violent, I'm not sure violence, but we have sincere disagreements on issues. But the fact that we can disagree respectfully increases our, you know, our bond, if you will. So that's really important to me. I guess also deep down, I like people that get involved and do something. You know, I get kind of tired around with people sitting around bitching about stuff when in fact, if they'd step up, they could do something about it. And so I kind of gravitate to people that say, here's a problem, I think I can do something about it, let's get started and make things happen. Those are the 2 things I guess that come to my mind.
Very nice. And I appreciate how you always are there to help those people that are stepping in and trying to make a difference.
Thank you.
So much appreciate that. We've got another question in the chat, Tori.
Michael Harrison asks, what are you itching to do after COVID?
Well, it should be pretty obvious. I want to get out and be around people again. I you know, that I just can't do that as much as I would like. And so I'm really looking forward to being able to go out and be around people and be in groups and interact and talk about issues and all of that stuff. That's what I'm looking forward to and what I miss most.
Great. Any other questions in the chat, or does anybody want to raise their hand?
Janae Gardner has one. Janae, I can unmute you if you want to ask it yourself.
I just wanted to say thank you to Mr. Hamilton, who was my principal from kindergarten through 12th grade,
Oh,
for 4th and 5th grade, and you have always been one of my most favorite people. So I just wanted to say I love you, and I can't wait to see you out in public too. Give you a big hug and a kiss. So that's
Thank
great.
you, Janae. It's kind of a funny story. Janae is one of those, when they moved me to North Shore, there was a group of students, and literally all the way through North Shore, I was their principal. Then when they went to the middle school, I was moved to the middle school and went to the high school. It's kind of a funny story. And it was kind of touching. I think the first group decided that they were going to, each of them as they came to the stage was going to bring a silver dollar. Now there were about 125 students. So you think about that. As the thing went on, I started putting the dollars in my pocket and stacking them on the stage. The next year, they all decided they were going to bring a bear, and there was about 125 students in that graduating class. So some of them brought these great big gigantic bears, some of them, so I had 125 bears all over the stage. But it was really a touching kind of a thing, because these were students that knew me well and I knew them well, because I had started with them in kindergarten and we had sort of grown up together. But thank you, Janae, you're very kind.
Oh, of course.
That's amazing. So you still have those silver dollars, Phil?
No, I don't. I donated them to somebody. I forget who.
Good. They would have worn holes in your pockets for sure by now.
Sure.
All right. Well, we're a little bit over time, I think. So thank you, everybody, for all the great questions. Last call, if anybody has, oh, I see a hand waving. Are you waving goodbye, Julie, or did you have a question? I think it's a goodbye wave. Yes. Okay.
Thanks for being here. Thank you
All
all.
right. Phil, thank you for everything. You're amazing, and we love you.
Thank you very much. It's been fun. Bye-bye.